Is a new track a bad dream for the driver or the whole team? In this issue, I propose to talk about how races adapt to the new tracks. Keep this series in touch, let's go! When a new track appears on the championship calendar, it's always super interesting. Teams start looking at possible settings and working on the simulator very early, several months before the race, and this can affect the process of upgrading the cars. But the races have a tighter schedule, so they start preparing a little later. Last year, the Las Vegas Circus was added, and since there were high expectations associated with this Grand Prix, drivers thought about it as soon as the race was included in the season calendar. True, from the point of view of the fight in the championship, this stage was nothing interesting, but from the point of view of the conditions, in particular the weather condition, it was very interesting. Therefore, on the eve of the weekend, the most important question was where the cars could warm up the tires. Pirelli prepared the fall-winter series. However, the temperatures are still quite low. By the way, the Formula One temperature record is held by the Canadian Grand Prix in 1977, when the air in Montreal warmed up only to 5 degrees Celsius, and the winners took to the podium in warm jackets. But we digress a little. So, how do teams prepare for their arrival at new tracks? The answer is simple: simulation. In the case of Las Vegas, the team had to return to the most basic things. There was no information collected in previous years. There was nothing to rely on. And when they started working on the simulator, they started from the scratch. Initially, the work was carried out not on a simulator, but on a computer with a virtual racer in order to obtain basic settings and optimize trajectories without loss of objectivity. In order to start simulating the parameters, a standard model of the car is used, usually with basic settings, perhaps from some other track with a similar profile of turns and straights. This will be a good base before repeated changes and amendments in search of the ideal. The first simulations are aimed at finding the optimal angles of attack for the wings to find a compromise between drag and downforce. But at the same time, they will also look for the optimal settings such as ground clearance and stabilizer stiffness. In the past, the program always drove the car along a path that the engineer assigned at random. Now the computer itself calculates the optimal trajectory depending on the settings in order to achieve the best lap time. Of course, a good car model and virtual racing will be useless if we cannot reproduce the track itself well enough. And for the first simulation, there is not at all the data on the track. For new routes, teams first receive a 2D map, which they must digitize, enter all coordinates of the road surface and its limits, and this may not contain information, for example, about elevation changes. Usually this data appears later. Such a map is primarily based on the data of the architects on whom it's built, so there will be definitely not be such details as curves. Therefore, the simulation assumes that the car is always within the track. The first stage of research is AMP and multi-factor optimization. In this case, the engineer sets limits for the parameters, which can then be varied. For example, for the front clearance, the limits will be set from 15 to 20 mm, and for the wings, the entire possible range of adjustments will be set. And it won't be unusual if 9 or 10 settings were explored in this way. The simulator then automatically checks the various variable options and provided the result in the form of a special diagram, where the input parameters were marked on different axes, and all this together with output parameters such as lap time, maximum speed, ground clearance in front and behind the car. At first glance, it looked like an incomprehensible web of data, but even a short analysis already gives an idea of at least the lap time and the maximum speed. From this point on, the basic settings are selected and then the real simulation begins. Input data and algorithms for finding the ideal trajectory are replaced by the driver, who, based on visual perception and the work of his vestibular system, controls the car and gives feedback. At this stage, more details are required, and for this, LiDARs are used for scanning on the roads, which make it possible to obtain all necessary reference points on the road and photorealistic representation of the terrain. All this requires a lot of computing power because the operation of the engine and transmission is also simulated, because, among the other things, the same unit installed in the car itself must process data from these nodes. The writer at this stage works with the engineer to optimize the settings. Lap time becomes the goal, but the engineering team uses the same data analysis tools that they will normally use during the race weekend on the track to assess the stability of the tires and, if the track detail is good enough, the speed of pit stops taken into account and the entry into the pit lane. At the beginning of the training, the driver should already have an almost perfect knowledge of the track. Although, of course, in the first laps, when he first begins to perceive it from the car and feel the level of grip, the sensation will still be specific, especially in low temperature conditions. However, by the end of the first series of laps, the driver should be able to control the car in more or less normal manner. When studying a new route, drivers even tape a diagram of it somewhere in the cockpit, and exactly the same diagram will be in front of the engineer's eyes. Then, when discussing certain turns, they will know for sure that they mean the same things. All these are the most basic things, but if you don't have a map of the track at hand, or if you don't immediately remember its configuration, then you can lose a lot of time trying to explain where exactly a specific bump is on the track or whether the car starts to skid. Ultimately, the driver reaches the desired level of speed on the new route under the condition of effective work with the engineer and adaptation to unexpected difficulties. Of course, such preparation reduces the chance of spectacle, which we love so much. But, as it turns out in practice, we often still observe very interesting events on the track.